Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099 and I wanted to do a review of a book that I somewhat recently got on a trip where I got several other books. This is one of the first ones that I read from that trip. This is the 2007-2008 Metal Men miniseries, written and drawn by Duncan Rouleau, who is from Man of Action. I believe that studio is fairly well known as the creators of the Ben 10 cartoon. When you Google this guy, that's more or less what he's most well known as. This series was loosely based on some concepts drawn up by Grant Morrison when he was working on the 52 series. I don't know exactly how much of it was from the mind of Grant Morrison and how much of it was from the mind of Duncan Rouleau. There's not really any way to tell. All I know is in one of the trade paperbacks for the 52 series, Dan Didio talked about how Grant Morrison came up with some ideas, and instead of using those ideas in the 52 series, it was decided to just let the Metal Men have their own 8-issue miniseries, and that's where this story comes in. I want to start this review by saying this story has some fantastic artwork. A couple of times I actually had to double check to make sure that Chris Bachalo was not involved with the art here. I am a huge Bachalo fan. I really like his work. I really like this artwork here. It's very Bachalo-esque. If you do like Chris Bachalo's work, then you are probably going to like this story. If you don't like Bachalo's work, then you're probably not going to like this as much. Having said that, the art is the best thing about this book. This story is extremely not good. There are several reasons that it's not good, and I'm going to try and cover each reason point by point. First, I want to say there are some fantastic concepts in this book. The idea of Chemo, the giant chemical blob thing, as a CEO of a company full of robots. The idea of the Death Metal Men and Doc Magnus's brother being turned into a supervillain. All of these ideas are really amazing ideas and could have sustained some really interesting stories, but none of these concepts are really used effectively. For example, Doc Magnus's brother, he doesn't really make his debut as a villain in this story until the very last page. He's sort of not a nice guy throughout the entire story, but he's not really a full-on villain until the very end. And I'm pretty sure that there was never a story that capitalized on this idea of Doc Magnus having to fight his own family. Also, Chemo as a CEO of a company, once we find out that Chemo is the CEO of this company, we don't really have anything that explores this idea. The Metal Men just fight the robots in a fist fight. It's really kind of a fairly mundane exploration of that idea, which could have been very interesting. Also, even when you take away these concepts which are interesting and are just not explored very much, the story itself is pretty confusing. There are 4 or 5 different kinds of villains in this story. We have a group of robots who are trying to free all of robot kind from slavery underneath the humans, and they don't really have a whole lot to do because we have so many other villains here. We have Dr. Morrow, who is kind of sort of building as a villain throughout this thing, but then he doesn't really get anything to do. Then we have Dr. Magnus's brother, who doesn't even become a villain until the end of the story. Then we have this thing called the Nameless. Then we have Chemo and his company of robots. We have a whole lot of different villains who show up in this story, but because they are all vying for screen time, ultimately none of them really get anything interesting to do because they are all showing up at different times, and I'm always trying to keep up with, okay, what is the goals and motivations of this villain right here? How does this villain differ from that villain over there? We've got too many villains in this story, and this story is 200 pages long. That's not a short story. This should have been plenty of room to explore a villain who has some sort of evil plan that we can understand. The problem is when you have 4 or 5 different kinds of villains with different kinds of motivations, it's really hard to put all of that down on page and make it understandable for the audience. Ultimately, I did not come away from the story really understanding what any of the villains were really wanting to accomplish in this story. Also, time travel makes things about 10 times more confusing in this story than they needed to be. This was probably the single most confusing aspect of this entire book. I often had trouble telling if the story was being set in the present day or at the very beginning of the history of the Metal Men around the dawn of the modern heroic age. This story jumps around so much between these 2 points of time, it's really hard for me to get a good grasp on this story because it can't decide what it wants to be. Either tell a Metal Men Year 1 story, or tell a modern story after the events of 52, but don't try to do both at once. And I don't mean that this story is confusing to the theoretical brand new comic book reader who has never read a comic book story before, and this is the first comic book story that he or she has read, and it would be confusing to them. I mean that this story is confusing to me. And I don't mean to brag, but I have read hundreds of comic book stories, and I'm fairly familiar with the DC Universe as a whole, and this story was confusing to me. If it's going to be confusing to someone who has a pretty good grasp on the DC Universe, then it's definitely going to be confusing to someone who's fairly new to comic books. I feel like this story doesn't really have a target audience. It's going to be pretty confusing to anyone who tries to read this thing. This is an example of a story that I went in really expecting to enjoy after really enjoying the Metal Men and Doc Magnus in 52, which was where this whole series was springboarded from. But ultimately, this miniseries was just a waste, and I would almost be willing to bet money that it killed any chances for more Metal Men stories, at least until they showed up in the New 52. That's about all I have to say here, guys. What did you guys think of this story? Did you like it more than I did? What did you think of this review? If you liked it, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will be back tomorrow with some other kind of video. Until then, I'll see you guys later. Have a great day.